This War of Mine, a survival strategy game where you grimly attempt to endure in a lawless war-torn city full of armed bandits, constant casualties, and the daily struggle to not go and pillage a defenseless old couple's house for all of their supplies. This is how my playthrough went. Apparently, there are different character groups that can be played, offering slightly different experiences, but from the title screen all I was presented with was Survive, which allocated me a trio of everyday citizens grossly unprepared to handle the horrors of war. A reporter named Katia, TV chef Bruno, and sports ball star Pavle. They've managed to find an abandoned house to bunker down in to try and see out the war. It takes the rest of the day to clean up, collect loot, and build a bed, after which I'm asked to plan for the coming night by choosing who gets to sleep in the bed, who gets to sleep somewhere else, and who gets to go out and scavenge for supplies. Even though Katia and Pavle have more inventory space, I sent the TV chef out to brave the night because I don't know what backpack space is yet. My first night's attempt is at an abandoned cottage, which thankfully is true to its name as there is no one in sight and plenty of stuff to scoop up. I get Bruno to fill his bag and head home to see if anything else happens overnight. In this case, the night was calm at home base, but I find out later that that won't always be the case. With some food and materials in hand, things look okay for the time being. I get the new roomies to finish clearing the house, build a couple more beds for everyone, and start to settle into a rhythm. The next night sees me realize that 12 is a larger number than 10, so I choose to send Katia out to revisit the cottage even though Pavle is faster, not tired, and isn't sick, ruling me out from leading any group of anyone in an apocalypse. She grabs as much as she can and comes home to find that we were raided during the night. They stole some food and clean water and wounded both Pavle and Bruno. The game gently informs me that having someone stay awake and guard at night might be beneficial. Any optimism I had quickly evaporates as my hungry, tired, sick, and wounded people can do nothing but keep themselves busy building improvements that hopefully pay off later in the game. Suddenly there's a knock on the door and my first thought is that it's either some more unfortunate souls seeking shelter from the war or some polite bandits seeking to remove my supplies from my possession. Interestingly, there was an option C, a dude called Franco offering to trade commodities. Now let me tell you, this guy is the real MVP, wandering the streets alone, lugging around a sack full of supplies ripe for the stealing, to visit houses of people that may or may not be interested in seeing what's inside his other sack. Since Katia apparently has bargaining skills, I send her to the door to do business, bartering for some badly needed bandages and food, slightly alleviating my dire situation. Bruno, being the good cook that he is able to turn our raw food into something a little more palatable, extending the periods between feeding. I also opt to try and save on medicine and bandages by trying to sleep off any ailments, which works to an extent. Having settled into a routine, this continues throughout the days where people show up asking for varying levels of assistance, from medical supplies to digging people out of rubble and the odd random night raid. Franco and his big balls show up every few days to trade, and I start branching out to scavenge other sites. On night 7 with Pavle scooping, out a shelled school, I have my first encounter with other survivors, and do what I would probably do in real life, and that is get the fuck out. The next night I send Katia back and discover that they aren't a threat and are just trying to get by the same as me. Though a few nights later when I return, I do learn that not everything is free to loot, and that some people have their own private stash of stuff they've squirreled and they'd rather you keep your desperate digits to yourself. I come very close to pinching a piece of their plunder, but I think better of it since there's plenty of unclaimed goods I've yet to pick up. I'm managing to keep the crew afloat with what I bring home every night, though I find myself pushing the boundaries of starvation to gauge its effects. Pro tip, it's not great. Even so, my home operations are expanding. I'm able to collect clean water for cooking and craft a trap to catch rats for additional food. Night 13 becomes a real test of character. I decide to investigate a quiet house described as being in an untouched housing estate away from the war where people are trying to lead normal lives. I figure I'd try touching some of that normality. True to its description, I find an unaffected home inhabited by an ineffectual old couple that plead with me to not steal their shit. I begrudgingly comply, I'm not a complete savage yet, and simply search the premises for anything that I can take that won't raise any klepto flags. The old dude takes offense at me for going all Here's Johnny on his basement door and freaks out. I was just seeing to see if he had anything I could take that wouldn't be construed as thievery behind his two locked... I'm starting to sympathize with his position. All said and done though, I find a few useful items outside the home, so not a total loss, other than the reduced lifetime of the geriatrics I just frightened. With guilt kept to a minimum, I return home to find a somewhat successful raid had transpired in the night, highlighting the need to prioritize patching up the home to keep the bandits out. Speaking of which, the next night becomes my first encounter with hostility at the small apartment building. Apparently people don't like it when you break in and raid their homes. Still, I secured a full backpack without incident and happily returned home with intentions to come back and finish picking it clean. Something I attempted a couple of nights later. Night 16. I send Pavle back to the apartment. With the easily reachable loot already acquired, I needed to head higher up into the building if I intended to not go home empty-handed. This would prove dangerous and ultimately deadly. I accidentally get spotted on the second floor and immediately get shot in the back. I run for the exit and make it with time to spare, but in a baffling moment of poor judgment that drives home how much I would be devoured in the wild, I instead wait outside the door thinking I may have lost my pursuer. When he inevitably bursts through the door, slashing at my chest, he tells me to go while you still can. Instead, I respond by flailing my crowbar into his face several times, but he eventually puts me down, and Pavle dies. Having heard the news in the morning, somehow, both Bruno and Katia's misery meters take a dive, with Katia suffering the most and slumping into depression, making her unwilling to do anything. Suddenly, there's a knock at the door. It's Captain Coincidence, fresh off the SS Convenience, though he introduces himself as Roman, a lonely survivor looking for a party to join, a position which had recently become vacant. A combat specialist of the rebel army, he would be an apt replacement for the recently deceased Pavle. Katia picks up where Pavle left off and completes a successful night raid of the small apartments, finding his body and recovering his unreturned loot in the process. Roman's introduction to the crew on his first night is to get wounded, protecting our own shelter from a raid in the night, while Bruno becomes sick overnight. Welcome to the shit. Impressively, I'm able to get the combat specialist to talk Katia down from depression, back to run-of-the-mill sadness where the rest of us reside, making her a little bit more productive. Things restabilize within the re-established 3-person team, with plenty of scavenged items being brought back each night, improved security, and a comfortable level of food. Although these renewed spirits would be short-lived, as while out at the very same apartments, Katia suffers the very same fate as Pavle, frustratingly dying to the very same bandits thanks to the very same poor judgment of the player. Now back down to 2 survivors, there would be no opportune replacement showing up at the door the next morning. From here on out, it seemed it would be only down to the Roman-Bruno duo to see it through the war, at least in this shelter. Still recovering from earlier wounds, Roman continues to fulfill the role of night scavenger, while Bruno continues to fight off his sickness, exacerbated by a sinister new foe, the falling temperatures of the oncoming winter. A few days go by and Bruno recovers slightly, no thanks to my obstinate hoarding of medical supplies to try and save them until things get really dire. And they do. Day 25. Fortune comes knocking again though, as a much needed third member for the household appears on our doorstep. Anton, an aging professor who is apparently good at maths, but not much else it seems, with his minimal bag space, slow movement, and inadequate guarding capabilities, incidentally set him up as more of a liability. Still, he's better than nothing. But this is when things really start to unravel. Almost on cue, on night 26, with Anton having just joined the team, I managed to yet again fail at combat with the combat specialist of all people, and Roman dies at the ruined villa. Which couldn't have happened at a worse time, as having run out of meds, the cold continues to make Bruno and Anton sicker, and I don't have enough fuel to keep the heater on and cook food. Bruno is severely ill and depressed at this point, and Anton, well, he ain't doing so good either. With both of them too sick to go scavenging, I get them both to sleep through the night in the hopes they get better. But wouldn't you know it, we get raided during the night and Bruno gets wounded, adding another ailment to his already lengthy list of conditions. His sickness does slightly improve, however, and with one less mouth to feed, food is becoming less of an issue. Anton remains terminally ill, unfortunately, so is completely useless, and it's up to Bruno to suck it up and become the scavenger. This doesn't do him any favors, sadly, as the cold and the situation cause him to slip back into severe illness and depression. Anton does his best to talk him down from depression despite being on death's door. Death comes knocking on our door during the night though, as we were raided once again and the fragile Anton getting wounded this time. With both characters suffering badly, I have no choice but to keep them in bed the whole day and abandon any hopes of going scavenging again. This fact gets solidified on night 31, when Anton passes away from his many conditions. Bruno is all that's left. Being severely ill and on his own, I can't risk sending him out scavenging in his condition and leaving the house completely unguarded, so he spends his days in bed recovering, fending off attackers in the night as they come. A few days later, the cold finally abates, which I had hoped would help his recovery. It doesn't. At this point, Bruno has seen 4 of his fellow refugees die over the last 30 days. 3 killed by other survivors, 1 taken by the grim, uncaring winter. He is now on his own, hungry, depressed, wounded, and terminally ill. To make matters worse, on day 36, a crime wave breaks out and the night raids become increasingly relentless. From day 39 onwards, night after night, bandits continue to attack the shelter, each night more aggressive than the last, with Bruno, despite being near death from sickness, valiantly doing his best to fend them off, getting more and more wounded in the process. Every day I pray that a new refugee arrives at the door to join the household, but no one ever comes. Day 42. With all the resting during the day and night, Bruno's terminal illness recovers slightly, back to severely ill, indicating that he's on the mend. But this is of little comfort, as the brutal bandit attacks have left him lethally wounded, and his mood falls from depression to broken. He's now bedridden and starving. I can't even get him to the kitchen to eat. On day 43, with his last ounce of strength, Bruno hangs himself. And that's the game. Feeling pretty dejected, I went and looked up just how long I was supposed to survive, or if there was an end to it at all, and wouldn't you know it, the ceasefire, the end of the war, and thus the end of the game, occurs from day 42 to day 45 at the latest. Talk about falling before the finish line. It's like the ending to that one movie, where the guy does the bad thing, and then moments later he realizes he didn't have to do the bad thing. Yeah, you know the one. Anyway, in response to unintentionally failing in the worst possible way, I did what any proud gamer would do following this piss-weak playthrough. I went back and replayed it and absolutely destroyed it. Get wrecked game, I maintained a full house of 4 people for 45 days without losing anyone. Basically restarted the industrial age from the basement, and by the end was actually selling food, meds and bandages to make other luxury items. I was almost disappointed when the war ended. I feel like I could have gone on indefinitely, rebooting the economy from the confines of my kitchen. But I guess it interestingly gave me some contrasting perspectives on war. The raw misery of a long, tortuous and ultimately futile struggle to survive, and the gratifying accomplishment of building a sustainable enterprise from the casualties of conflict. Ah, video games.